This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
That tension between marketing and engineering is not unique to Atari. You know, I've been around now long enough to see lots of other companies, and very often when a company's sales goals aren't achieved or product reviews are less favorable than one would like, I think generally marketing is the butt of the argument as to why it wasn't successful.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Peter Rosenthal worked at Atari from March 1979 through the middle of 1983. He joined Atari as a marketing research associate in the consumer division and served as vice president of business development in the home computer division, then vice president of strategic planning. After Atari, he moved to marketing and sales at Designware, an educational software startup that published software for the Atari 8-bits and other platforms. This interview took place May 18, 2015.
And I was there from, I think it was probably like March of 1979 through mid-year 1983. So I saw a lot of, I came before the personal computer was on the marketplace, did a lot of competitive analysis before it came out, and then was there through the launch of the Atari 1200 computer.
Okay. And it sounds like maybe you left when the Trammels came in?
I actually left before that.
Okay.
I can't remember anymore exactly when they came in, but I left before James Morgan became, I think, CEO of Atari, and then after that, the Trammels took over. So I'd say probably at least 6 months, if not more, before the Trammels took over.
All right. Well, let's start at the beginning. How did you get started at Atari?
Okay. Well, first of all, my job at Atari was a career change for me. Actually, I had come from an academic background in the life sciences. Had been at Stanford for about 8 years as a researcher in basic cancer biology. Decided I didn't want to stay in that field. I'd gotten very interested in personal computers and business, and through some family friends was introduced to Atari, I think about a year after it was acquired by Warner Communications. And so I started out in marketing with the intent of spending 3 months each in each of 4 departments: marketing, sales, finance, and manufacturing.
Well, that's an interesting strategy. Was this their plan or your plan?
It was a combination of what I wanted and what they thought would be useful, and at the end of that, I was going to choose which of the 4 I wanted to pursue long term. But it turned out that I really liked the marketing piece so much. It was a time of great activity, growth, and challenge in marketing, and I really liked it. So I never went to the other 3 parts of the business. And also, that was a period of time when there was a lot of personnel turnover at Atari. At that point, when I joined, the personal computer group and the games group were not separated. They were one enterprise with the same marketing department and the same sales department and basically the same engineering group. It was only later on that those things got separated and personal computers became a separate division. So, games was growing very rapidly. The computer was under development but not finished. I sort of became the in-house expert on the competition, Apple, Commodore PET, Radio Shack, and sort of trying to line that up against what we thought the specs were going to be for the Atari computer. So at the end of my first year, a lot of the marketing department was let go. And so I was sort of the only one kind of left in marketing with any experience on the computer side of things. There are a bunch of game people still left. So that sort of was an opportunity to get promoted by default.
Right. All right. So before we get you promoted, to what extent do you feel, in your opinion, was the Atari 400 and 800 a marketing-driven machine as opposed to technology or something?
Well, there was always a tension, I think. I think from a technical standpoint, all of us who knew the machine and the competition knew that technically, at least in terms of performance, the Atari computers, both of them, the 400 and the 800, were, quote, better than Apple, for example, partly because of the custom graphics and sound chips that were in it, which were on top of the 6502 processor, right, which we had and which Apple had as well. So performance-wise, the Atari could do a lot more. But I think we never really successfully communicated that, except to sort of the more sophisticated, elite customers who really were the kinds who liked to look under the hood and compare. Probably a lot of them are your listeners, or who read Attic magazine and stuff like that.
Right.
But from a marketing standpoint, we weren't terribly successful at communicating that. And I think a lot of people viewed it as just another fancy game machine.
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to that issue maybe later on in our conversation.
Okay.
Because there was some internal effort to try to make that separation much clearer.
Right. Right. Well, it seems from what I've heard in other interviews that Atari was sort of trying to do two things at once with that machine. They wanted it to be a productivity machine that was also a great game machine. And I suspect as a marketing person, that's hard.
It is hard, and a significant part of my energy and time at that point, that was before I was responsible for strategic planning, was working with existing third-party software developers to try to ensure that when the machine launched and early on and in its life, there was a fairly broad spectrum of software products out there that ran on the machines, some for productivity, some for education. The games part of it was pretty well taken care of because of Atari's internal capabilities. So, we had some good games, some unique ones that only ran on that, and then some others that were adaptations from the 2600.
Mm-hmm.
So I had worked with a lot of third-party developers who were porting products onto the Atari. I mean, one of the early ones I met were the people at Personal Software, Dan Falstra in particular, who I think at that early stage, VisiCalc wasn't done yet. But I think I was one of those people who got an early glimpse of it when it was done or nearly done, and was able to work with what it became VisiCorp, but work with Personal Software to get them to port it to our machine. So that was probably the best productivity product on the machine.
Sure.
There were some others which I can talk about later.
Okay.
Atari, before I came, had this educational line of products, I'd say probably fourth grade through 12th, which were based, I don't know if you ever saw them, but basically they were tape-based products that ran on a specialized cassette player that plugged into
the Dorset educational tapes.
Dorset, which were terrible, to be honest. I tried to get it killed unsuccessfully because the company already had a contract with Dorset, and I don't think that helped us in the eyes of consumers or potential buyers. I think that was really poor.
Really? Why? Okay, I'd like to hear more about this. From my perspective, from my perspective, in those really early days, Atari was trying to figure out what this machine was going to be. Hey, let's come out with some educational software. We've got a bunch of games. Let's do some Atari Lab and things like. And it kind of, is it a business machine? So I think the experiment was an interesting one. Why did you think that it should have been killed?
I think the experiment was an interesting one, but I think the Dorset products were not the right educational products to capture anybody's interest or attention. They were kind of boring. They ran very slowly. Internally, there were all sorts of technical problems we had actually getting them to work reliably. It took a lot of energy on Atari's part. So I'll give you an example of what I think was a better educational product. I don't remember the exact name of the product, but there was a typing tutor product that I thought really worked well. And it was available in various guises for different machines, but there was one for the Atari. I think that was a better use of the technology, for example. Just on that line, Atari, I guess like a lot of big successful companies, often found it very difficult to acquire or integrate new technologies coming from the outside. There's a huge NIH, not invented here, resistance at Atari, and anything that was brought and said, gee, we ought to do something like that, or we should acquire this product, the engineering team would always say, we can do it better, we can do it better. And sometimes they could, but sometimes they couldn't do it in a very timely manner because they were doing lots of other things. So that was always a struggle. Can we acquire a product, or are we going to do it ourselves? But that's not uncommon, I think. I think Apple has been that way a lot in its history, and I think lots of other companies.
Right. And you'd said that you were kind of the guy in charge of knowing the competition, and you talked a little bit about what Atari did better. Did you feel at the time that there were Atari machine was lacking versus Apple or the other machines in certain aspects?
Yeah, I did actually. Well, I guess there are two things that particularly stood out in my mind kind of from the beginning, and it's mostly in comparison to Apple. As you probably know, to add memory to an Atari, you had to buy from Atari a memory cartridge, which was quite large, if you remember. So that made them more expensive than just adding RAM chips to the board of an Apple II. And there was a reason for that. Atari was, I guess I would say, sort of saddled with a difficult history that came from its game machine. It took Atari with the 2600 a long time to pass the FCC regulations for radiation emitted. So there's a lot of engineering that went into the 2600 to get through that barrier. So the same mentality came into play when they were designing the Atari computers, so that the reason those memory things were on big boards and in a huge plastic housing was there was a lot of shielding in there to prevent radiation that would interfere with telecommunications. Apple never seemed to worry about that very much. And so that it made add-ons to our machine more difficult. And another example is the hard drive. I don't know if you recall the size of an external hard drive for an Apple compared to the big hard drives, not hard drives, these are floppy disk machines, I'm sorry, that Atari had. I think the Ataris were probably 4 times the cubic volume of an Apple floppy disk. So that made them both more expensive and just also less attractive because they took up a lot of space.
Right.
But that sort of goes back to this FCC concern.
Right. Okay, so you're doing the marketing, and then what's next?
So what's next? So after I was able to hire a number of people who worked with me. I brought in a new person to sort of keep up on the competitive analysis, who was very accomplished and much smarter than I was, and did a really great job and really was able to keep up very well on what was going on in the industry. I'll just tell you a funny story. I won't mention names, but after about 3 years at Atari, he had an offer to go to Microsoft, and he took it, and my boss, who was head of the computer division, we were sorry to see him go, tried to convince him to stay and said, why do you want to go to a teeny company like Microsoft? That's never going to go anywhere. So that turned out, he made a really smart decision. Microsoft was small at that time, but it grew pretty rapidly.
I just interviewed someone, I think, who you're talking about, who told me the story from the other perspective. Tandy.
Yeah, that's who it is. So did he tell you the same story?
He told me the exact same story. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. As long as he told it and you're using his name, that's okay. But I didn't want him to come to me. Yeah.
Funny.
He was a great guy. He's really good, and I'm still in touch with him occasionally. So anyway, also I brought in a couple of people who were very knowledgeable in computer education, who reached out and brought us a lot of other people who were both going to use the computers in schools and brought to us some ideas for educational programs that were, I think, much better quality than the Dorset materials.
Mm-hmm. Are we done? Shall we move on to when you got promoted?
My recollection of the timing is not so great, but probably about a year and a half after I joined, so that would probably put us somewhere in the mid to late 1980s. 1980, Atari separated games and computers into two separate divisions. They hired a CEO for the computer division. I stayed with that division. This was Roger Bodicher. I don't know if you interviewed him or not. It might be interesting if he's willing.
Yeah, I need to look him up.
Yeah, he was there for at least 2.5 years, maybe more. And at that point in time, Atari the computer division moved to new facilities down in North San Jose and began to develop its own separate manufacturing facility. There had been some conflicts between the games division and the computer division in terms of sort of who got priority in manufacturing engineering attention. Mm-hmm. And so separating them out was one way to make sure that those two things did not conflict. So I started to work for the new CEO of the division, and he's the one who sort of convinced me to kind of move into the strategic planning area and promoted me to that position. So it was really a question of needing to look further out into the future in terms of what was happening and where we needed to go and how we were going to really position ourselves against the competition and, what new products we needed to bring on. We developed in conjunction with printer manufacturers, we built some custom printers that worked with the Atari machine and stuff like that. But just sort of going back to a point I mentioned early on, we were lobbying pretty hard that we ought to consider changing the name of the computers from Atari to something else because it still had this games connotation. And we also...
It was saddled with the games
it was a
connotation that went with it.
Yeah, right. I think a lot of people still viewed it as a fancy games machine, even though it could do lots of other things. And we also had some fairly advanced talks to licensing the technology to, I won't mention names, but to some other well-known consumer product manufacturers. We would keep making it ourselves, but we would also allow them to make it under their name. That was a long internal political and strategic discussion with the top management at Atari, who ultimately decided that was not a way we should go, so we were not able to conclude a deal.
So there could have been Atari-compatible machines made by other manufacturers, or at least branded by other manufacturers.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Can you remember any of the companies that you were talking to?
Yeah, I think we talked to Radio Shack. We talked to Zenith. There are probably one or two others that aren't coming to mind at the moment, but ultimately we kind of shut those discussions down just because top management just couldn't see that as a viable way to go.
Yeah.
The other thing, I think we certainly weren't the first, but pretty early on we recognized, and it sort of became my responsibility to get the Atari machine hooked up to a modem and to develop some applications that were potentially non-gaming and useful. So we brought in an outside consultant, actually, who built a prototype modem that worked pretty well with the Atari, and we ultimately manufactured it. And part of my group's responsibility was finding some good players on the outside who we could use this technology with. So I know we early on had a relationship with Dow Jones, so you could get stock quotes and financial information using. It's hard to believe that we were using an acoustic modem at that time, but everyone else was also. And also developed a working relationship with what was then, I think, Crocker Bank, which is now, I think, ultimately became part of Wells Fargo, where you could check your bank balance, you could write checks through them. So that was pretty early use of the technology in a pretty constructive way, although the communication was slow because of the acoustic modem.
So, so you mentioned modems and you mentioned printers. Any other peripherals that you were working on having created?
We brought in a light pen from the outside, which I think was pretty successful. The software was developed by the outside party, and we manufactured the pen, and I think that did pretty well. It was kind of a pretty unique application. At the time, you could do drawing, you could play games, you could write with it. And we spent a lot of time developing an accounting program, which unfortunately I was responsible for, and was going along very poorly. And thanks to some help I got from the outside, an outside accounting consultant to Atari, they basically recommended that we kill it. So we never actually brought the product out, but we put a lot of energy and time into trying to get it. And it was pretty clunky.
Huh. Because, I mean, like Atari they forced something out because they came out with that big box of, like, had the keypad in it. I think it was called the accountant package, and it had the keypad and, I don't know, some sort of software was in there.
Yeah, I think, I didn't realize that actually, I guess my memory's not as good. I didn't realize that we actually came out with it. I don't think we sold very many. We didn't support it for very. And I think it required 2 disk drives, 2 floppy drives.
Right.
That was a huge package. And I think it was hard to get people to take it seriously.
Right. Sure.
There was, though, internally, you probably, I'm pretty sure you know because of some of the people you've interviewed, Atari had this advanced R&D lab, not the one that Alan Kay ran, but there was another one up in Grass Valley that did a lot of the advanced development on the chips and some other things. And one of the engineers up there came up with a pretty clever solution for a word processing machine. The challenge was that we could only put, I think, 40 characters up on a line on a TV screen, and he came up with a fairly unique way to make that work. So that was developed internally and did pretty well. I think we sold a lot, and a lot of it was actually in use internally at Atari. And then we came out with a VisiCalc cartridge, which did quite well. So another thing that's sort of happening here, probably, a year after the computer division gets separated out, is, we're sort of ready for the next generation computer. And the first one was sort of done within the games division. This time, we had our own design team, and I wasn't responsible for that, but we brought in a very talented marketing guy who did a great job of working with outside designers to come up with what I always thought was a pretty nice design for the Atari 1200. So we were chugging along with next generation products at a pretty good clip.
So can you, maybe it sounds like you maybe weren't involved with this, but I'm going to ask anyway. Can you speak to the change in the design in the 1200? I mean, it went to a industrial design from the, I'm a friendly typewriter design of the early machines.
Yeah, so in the development of the 1200, there are a lot of factors that were taken into account. One was that the 800 was, a lot of people didn't like the 400, even from the beginning, with a membrane keyboard, and the only reason that was done was it was a way to introduce a product at a lower price point. We just couldn't get a mechanical keyboard that was inexpensive enough then. But that never did particularly well, the 400. So the 800 at least was a more easily usable machine because of the keyboard, but it was pretty clunky. I mean, it was big, it was heavy. So one of the criteria in designing the new one was that it be slimmer, sleeker, lighter, more physically attractive, and so those were sort of the design guidelines. I think the 6502, its next generation, had come along, so we could have a faster machine. My recollection is it did not require memory cartridges. So those are sort of the criteria, but it went through a lot of testing, both consumer testing and engineering testing to make sure it was buildable, robust, more easily manufactured. That was another whole set of criteria. You wanted something that had because of its construction, the 800 had a lot of separate components inside, one of which had the potential to fail or for connection to fail. So this was more streamlined. I think it was a single board or maybe at most two. So it's much more reliable inherently.
You mentioned a bunch of products that you worked on that you mentioned, for instance, the accounting package didn't come out. Were there any other products that come to mind, either software or hardware, that you guys were thinking about but never came out?
None that jumped to mind, but I suspect there were a bunch of them. Because we had a pretty big software division of our own at that point, and they were broken down into 4 or 5 different categories, education, games, productivity, et cetera. And so there's always stuff sort of bubbling along, but at that point in time, I wasn't directly responsible, so I didn't know everything that was going on.
So with the release of the 1200, were you all involved at all with the release of the peripherals that matched it, the new disk drive and
Well, I was aware of them, but I didn't.
Okay. I
wasn't responsible for their design or manufacture, or even at that point the marketing of them. There was a marketing department that really handled that. I was now doing strategic planning. Okay.
So tell me about strategic planning. I mean, what were you thinking about?
So I had a small group of 2 other people who worked with me on that, and then we interacted with the various divisions, and I think probably at least every 6 months, if not every 3, we would actually go off site with the heads of each of the divisions and sort of think and talk about where we needed to go, what was possible. With the marketing department, we had quite a bit of input on what people seemed to want. Atari had a very active market research group, which was a separate group who had input on that, and we would probably spend half a day, sometimes a full day, trying to map out where we were, where we needed to go, what was possible, what other people were doing. And so my role was sort of pulling those meetings together, and in between meetings kind of staying in touch with each of the department heads to kind of see what their concerns and issues were. It was also a time to kind of check up on schedules, although we did that more frequently than quarterly. I think every week or two we had a status meeting where people would report on the status of various projects that were going on.
Right. So did the decisions that marketing made seem sensible to you at the time? I asked you this is a today, if you talk to people about what was wrong with Atari back in the day, some people who have opinions will fling, arrows at marketing. Oh, marketing didn't know what it was doing. Marketing, just will say marketing was inept in this way or that way. So I'm asking you to maybe defend marketing and tell me what if the decisions made sense at the time.
So, first of all, I think that that tension between marketing and engineering is not unique to Atari. I've been around now long enough to see lots of other companies, and very often when a company's sales goals aren't achieved or product reviews are less favorable than one would like, I think generally marketing is the butt of the argument as to why it wasn't successful. And so I don't feel a strong need to defend marketing. We made some mistakes, I think, for sure. But I think there's also, the engineering teams always felt they knew better, and if it was in their hands, things would have gone better.
Right.
We had some ad campaigns that I don't think were particularly good.
For instance?
I can't even specifically remember. I just know there was an early one about something about the future, and it was sort of so vague. It's hard to know why anyone would be attracted to it. And it was put together by a pretty big Madison Avenue agency. I mean, actually, in the early period, the late 70s, the early 80s, I think Apple actually did the best job of advertising and promoting their product, but nobody was quite sure how to position these things. And so everyone was playing around with lots of different ways, and I don't think we were. I don't think we stood out in any positive way for what we did. I can't remember anymore some of the specific criticisms from engineering about how marketing screwed up and how they could have done better, but that certainly was not an uncommon criticism.
Okay. Were you involved at all with the getting Alda to be the spokesperson?
I had absolutely nothing to do with it. That was done at the very top of Atari, and probably even with some Warner Communications involvement.
Sure.
No, that kind of thing, and the negotiation over the rights to ET happened. Well, I know the ET thing happened beyond Atari. That was done at Warner. So those kinds of things were usually done at a level way above mine, and even way above the division president head. So
what happened next for you? You're strategically planning.
Yes, I'm strategically planning, or doing my best to. We went along doing that I think I probably did that for about 2 years. The CEO of the division at the time decided to leave and found a new company. So he left and took a couple people with him. So a new CEO of the division came in. I continued to do what I was doing, but he also brought in some new people who were his choosing, which is pretty common when there's a change at the top. So I sort of felt I was having less and less impact, and I was recruited away to a software startup. I was recruited to head up sales and marketing of an educational software startup in San Francisco just 83, 82, 83, 84 was a time when there were a huge number of privately funded educational software companies started, some in Boston, some here in the Bay Area. And so I was sort of attracted by that.
Right. Cool. And that was Designware, right?
That's correct.
You guys did a little bit of Atari software, didn't you? Designware?
Yes, we definitely did. We did software for the Atari, certainly for the Apple, and some for the IBM PC.
So how were you involved with the Atari stuff in any way at Designware?
Sure. I mean, my responsibility there was marketing and sales. So, I helped decide which of our programs would go on which machine, and I was engaged in discussions with Atari and with Apple, actually, about helping co-promote these products. So, yeah, I was pretty involved.
So how did you decide if a product was going to come out on the Atari or the Apple or some other platform?
Apple was really the most successful hardware platform for the kind of software that we were developing. So invariably, Apple would be the machine of first choice for any new products we're developing. And then depending on how easy or difficult it was to port them to either the Atari or the IBM, we would do that secondarily. Designware had an internal development tool that allowed us to port things fairly easily, not painlessly, but pretty easily, from one machine to another. So we would usually go on to the PC and the Atari after the Apple version came out. Also, Apple provided, at that point in time, quite a bit of support, not financial support, but promotional support and exposure support to third-party developers. So they would have regional shows where if you were a developer, you could have a booth there and they would help promote your product. Atari did not do that as effectively, and IBM did not do it at all.
Looking at the Designware stuff for Atari, it's interesting because it's all in black and white. So that tells me that the tool you're talking about, you're using for porting things, you use this tool and then maybe they were lazy and just didn't do much else other than port it over, and they didn't use any of the Atari's graphical capabilities.
They did not. It was cheaper and easier to just port it as is and not add any bells and whistles.
So as a marketing person, did you throw up your arms and say, "Hey guys, you're not using this machine to
That's a good question. I pushed them to do it, but there was a lot of engineering resistance to the amount of time and effort it would take to tweak it to make it unique to the Atari, which also probably is the reason Atari wasn't particularly enthralled.
Right. I mean, because the games
they want to
look good.
Really show off the capabilities of the machine.
Right. But Designware did have a game called Spelicopter, which is just an adorable name.
Yeah, and it was actually probably one of it was one of our best games, even though it was one of the earliest.
I would have bought it for my kid just based on the title. So.
Yeah, no, it was a great choice of title, and it was named before I got there, so I can claim no credit for it. It was already at least in the marketplace for Apple when I came on board.
What haven't I asked you that I should have about either your time at Atari or Designware?
I think you may have. I mean, for most of my time at Atari was a wonderful place to work. It was exciting. There were a lot of really smart, dedicated people there. We were in a new industry, both with games and with the computer, so there was a lot of enthusiasm. There was, in general, it wasn't 100% true. Politics was fairly minimal. I was able to work pretty effectively, I think, with both the engineering team and and the marketing and business team. Even though, periodically took these arrows from engineering and some screw-ups that at least in their opinion, marketing had made. So it was a really wonderful environment to work in. It had some shortcomings. I think separating out computer from the games division was a really smart move, and I think made both divisions work more effectively. But there was, it's probably true at most companies, there was a surprising amount of reluctance to consider things coming in from the outside, whether it be a new software product or a new hardware product. The engineers, who were very smart at Atari, I think always felt they could do it better. So they want to spend a lot of time looking at what other people were bringing to the party. And I think that was a shortcoming. I think we could have either designed some of our own things better had we taken a harder look at what others were doing, or we could have had some more products in the marketplace if we had acquired a few things. I know you interviewed, because I listened to it, Al Alcorn a while back. I interfaced with him quite a bit because I was always looking to him for, what's new, what can we do, what are you guys seeing on the engineering side? And he was a great person to interact with. He was very positive, supportive, enthusiastic about all kinds of ideas, and very, very smart and knowledgeable. And there were other people, Steve Mayer, who I worked with a lot, who was sort of the creator of the programmable video game, is someone who I worked with a lot. He was originally at Grass Valley and then moved to New York and set up an advanced research lab in New York City for Atari. So there are a lot of really great people, a number of whom you've interviewed.
But everyone I've talked to from the time has been lovely. Sounds like a great group.
Yeah, no, I feel very positive. I feel disappointed that Atari was not more successful in the computer business, not to mention that the games business sort of fell apart after a while, which might have been preventable. I'm not sure. I keep looking at, the new generations of games and see how big the volume is and the revenues on that side. And I think a lot of us keep wondering, could that have been Atari if we had done something differently over those intervening years? I'm not sure what the answer is.
Okay, here's my last question. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit users that you marketed to back in the day, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, number one, I thank them for their support and enthusiasm, because the user groups were really a great source of support for the company and the product, and they really helped get the word out there probably more effectively in some ways than marketing could itself. So their dedication and enthusiasm is really critical and important and valued. I think we tried to support them to the best of our abilities. I don't know how they felt about it. I think that's my main message that I communicate.
Great. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. If any other questions come up, I'm happy to try to answer them. And thanks for doing what you're doing.
You're welcome.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.